Okay, so we are going to go ahead and start learning more about the human's first language acquisition process today. And we are going to first watch several videos and take a look at how children are in the process of their first language learning. So let's take a look at some of them. If you can make connections to what we have talked about so far, that would be actually great. If you can find any other features that seems to be relevant to first language acquisition, please keep that in mind, or you can write your notes down so that we'll be able to share your ideas soon. And more specifically, if you can think about the theory of first language acquisition that we talked about last time, for example, nativist approach or behaviorist approaches, you can also write them down, and also the reasons why you think that particular theory seems to be highlighted in the following video. So let's take a look at one of them. First one. What?
You tell me what noise a fish makes. No, you only get one chance. That was it, brother. Yes, seriously. Okay, next question. Where's your ear? Good girl. Okay, last question. Think very carefully about this, okay? Who's your favorite? Dad or Mum? Okay, I didn't actually finish the question, done. Why don't we break for recess, have something to eat, and then come back to it, okay? Okay, you feeling better? Repeat after me. Dad, 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 dad. Who's your favorite? Okay, let's try something different. Who's your least favorite? Here we go. Who's getting a pony? And who's your favorite? No, I'm not picking you up until we get this sorted, okay? It's a battle of wits. Me and you. Okay. We had enough? All right, here we go. The last time, who's your favorite? Okay.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the next video. And this goes on. Let's move on to the next one because it's pretty much going to be the same. One. This is the final one.
But if you say no, you don't. What did you say? No, bad words. No. How funny. It's not funny.
Uh-oh.
It's not funny, I said. What did you say? Not funny? Yeah, it's not funny. What did you say? What? Tell me.
Oh boy.
Wagging. It's not funny.
Sorry.
It's not funny.
Okay.
Hello? Me?
You gonna pick up the phone? The pretend phone?
I'm not gonna talk to you. You say bad words. Goodbye.
You're so silly.
Okay, so with your neighbors, I want you to talk about any of the videos that you just watched. You can also focus on one over the other more in detail, but go over the four different theories that we briefly talked about, not briefly, that we talked about last time, and try to make connection of like, what do you think some of the challenges that we talked about seems to be reflected in the following video, for example, and make connection. And we'll talk about them in whole group. So for about 3 minutes, just turn around and talk to your neighbors and say hi, and then you guys can start your friend. You mentioned a child didn't understand. Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yes.
About this, but just have a conversation. About this, I'm going.
Session.
Yeah, the second video, I think I did it very something creative language and creative.
Actually, I don't even. I can't hardly agree that they are actually. Yeah. But
It seems like there's a conversation going on.
We're going to talk about the other one, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Technically, it's similar more like ant rather than human.
Yeah. But I feel like they create something like I don't know, they feel like they're understanding each other.
Oh,
So I too, like it's super separate. That's
I know.
That's good. If we have done the same language, trying to kick. But I also, yeah, it feels like for them something younger. Yeah. I'm not sure. Maybe it's been like this song. Like there's a language there in their head.
Did she announce?
She was like, yeah, she died and then like they won't.
Right.
Yeah, we talked about that, like, last week. I think that's in the period of time.
I think it has something to do with. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the videos together now.
Yeah.
So let's share what you guys have talked about in your own group. Does anyone want to share like one video and talk about what you have observed? Yeah.
I think the first video has a lot to do with the behaviors
Mhm.
approach when the father is trying to make the child say something and give him a prize. But then it also shows that it does not work always because he kept saying "stay dad" when he asked about who is the favorite, but she kept insisting that it's mom. So it shows like there's a problem with this theory. Yeah.
Yes. So I think you're absolutely right. He used a lot. I mean, you can understand that some of the subtitles are not what she actually meant, right? She probably did not swear and all, but we can kind of tell that the dad was keep on using words like "good girl," right? And showing the reinforcement that you guys were talking about, right? So, and he also specifically said like "repeat after me," right? So he wanted the baby girl to say like dad instead of mom, but we can actually see that. In addition to that, did anyone get another characteristic of a baby talking? Anything else? I mean, some of the challenges, I think the question is like some of the challenges in studying baby talk or children's, very young children's language acquisition. The dad was, he edited the video in a way, right? But you can see that it's quite long and it can actually tell us quite a lot about the children's attention span. They can't really sit down and like all of us, right? Sit down in a class, pay attention for about 45 minutes straight. That's very, very difficult. So you can actually see the snack, like the dad giving snacks, and in the middle, the child was getting frustrated, wanted to get out of the chair, for example. That's one of the reasons why it's somewhat difficult to really understand and do research with really young baby, like toddlers, for example. So that's another one I thought that came out during the video. Yeah. Any other comments that you wanted to make, or should we move on to the next one? I think the next one, we don't really hear any, I mean, we did hear sound, but what were you able to tell from the second video? What were the I think they were twins, right? They were basically doing that for the 2 minutes whole. But what were you able to get from that video about children's characteristics, for example? Or my question would be, what do you think the children were able to tell or have an idea of human discourse? Yes.
We first thought that is it actually should we actually think this is a language at first? So it's kind of just sounds like sounds and yelling at each other, but I guess they also use body language maybe. So that can be a language, and we started in a functional approach a little bit because although they weren't speaking a specific language, they seemed to have a kind of discourse and had a functional maybe, yeah, so we thought because, yeah, it's a functional approach and maybe body language is also a language.
I think that's an interesting point, how you said that they seem to be talking, right? So what gives us the idea that they did, of course, these babies did not enunciate words explicitly, but they seem to be talking to one another. What gave us that idea? The gesture for one, right? Anything else? Intonation, right? So they were like using different intonations, something. It seemed like they were using different types of intonation, one going up and rising and going down, right? Anything else?
They seem so engaging in the conversation, like they're focused on each other.
Yeah, they were looking at one another. The child that you see in the back, he was like laughing in response, right? And another one is that they were taking turns, right? When one was talking, the other one was listening,
Yeah.
right? So they were not really yelling at each other at the same time, but it seemed like they were taking turns while they were talking to one another. So there seems to be somewhat of an understanding that they already start having, that in human discourse or human conversation, one needs to talk while the other one listens, and it goes vice versa. And also the use of the gestures, as you mentioned, the responses, different types of responses, especially in this case with the gesture seems to come out. So it's not really the words that we say, but additional body languages and the understanding of how the flow of conversation moves forward is somewhat understood in this particular video. Good points. Moving on to the last one. How about this one? We can see a little bit grown up, right? And so it's not really mom or dad anymore, but you can see a girl seemingly on a pretended phone call, right? What were you able to get from this particular one?
I think she's not only mimicking the words or the sentence, she also mimicking the intonation and accent.
So does she seem happy?
No.
No, right? We can immediately tell that she's in a very uncomfortable state and she has a problem with the person who she's talking to. She kept on saying like things like, I'm not going, what did she say? She said like, what did you say? What did you say? Or I'm not going to say anything if you say something bad words or something. I forgot what her exact line was, but she is in that situation, this imaginative situation where it's very difficult to examine through the behaviorist or the nativist approach because she's already in that social discourse, which is not really with the immediate interlocutor who might be her parents, right? So she's very much engaged in that. And were anything else that you noticed? Another thing that might, in fact, tell us about how she's very much immersed in this imagination is that the dad or the mom towards the end says something about, are you done with your pretended phone call or something? So it's like we are bringing you back to the reality and saying that you're already in that pretended phone call. She, in fact, goes back to the pretended phone call. Did anyone get that? So after the parents, which parent? Says that, she goes back to the phone call and says goodbye, and she ends the phone call. So you can in fact find that a lot of these children's talk relies on their imagination, but here in this case, she might in fact be engaged in it by using creativity, but at the same time, we can understand that this is more related to the functional approach that we talked about because it includes that social interaction, right? So if you're interested in children's language learning process, I think there are a bunch of videos out there that parents are happy to share on YouTube. And there are a lot of funny ones, but which tells us quite a lot about how children, when we are talking about the children's language learning process, especially related to nature and nurture, we can't really disregard any one of them because it seems like the environment is very much important as much as the children's own intellectual capability. So I think let's move on to the next, but before we go to the next one, just to let you know, do you know why children, like babies' first words are usually mom or like mom instead of dad?
It's very easy to say.
Yes, it has to do with our mouth, the facials, I guess, our lips and our body structure. It has to do with the sound, how we make sound. And when we say mom, it has to only use the let's say exhaling of your breath and the lips, right, closing and just opening. But dad is a little bit different. So for some of you who might be dads later on, don't be too discouraged that your second next word is dad. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so I need to stop it. Let's move on to the next one. So some of the issues in first language acquisition has to do with, why is this not the whole slide? Okay, not matter. So it has to do with this idea of competence and performance. I think we talked about the difference between competence and performance before, right? Can anyone tell me what we talked about in terms of the difference between the two?
Competence is like our knowledge of language, like maybe some grammar or something else, and the performance is how we use language in either like comprehension or reproduction.
Yes, absolutely right. So one has to do with something that is underlying, and one is something that is visible more. So when we talk about competence, it has to do with more of the individual's underlying knowledge of a system. It could be an underlying knowledge of event or fact. This unobservable ability to use language would be referred to as competence. However, on the other hand, performance has to do with the word perform, right? You perform something, you act out something. So it has to do with the actual use of language, how people use the language rather than just know about the language. So it's very different in that way. So how we use the language has to do with the speaking skill, listening skill, writing skill, and also the reading skill. So how we understand those different skills has to do with the performance. So when you think about your tests, for example, language exams or language tests, a lot of the times it has to do with either the competence or performance. Let's say if we ask students to use the so let's say that your instructor is going to examine your performance or your conversation with another person and see whether how much language use you can, let's say the language repertoire or the vocabulary or grammatical mistakes that you make or how appropriate your language is. Then it is more based on performance, right? So it's more of a performance-based language assessment. However, if I give up you guys out like a paper-based language test, which is more focused on, let's say, grammatical rules or vocabulary learning, or how you be able to understand such expressions, it will be more related to competence, right? So in that case, it's slightly different, what you know and how you actually can perform. So I think the gap in between, a lot of the times, especially Korean English education had a lot to do with competence-based long time ago. But since it was criticized that we have very intellectual students with dictionary almost in their mind, but can't really talk to somebody. In that case, performance was criticized, the lack of performance. So then nowadays, it's much more, I think, in between. So trying to gather more knowledge of the students' individual competence and their performance. So treating them a little bit differently. Has any one of you taken the TOEFL test, for example, recently? Previously? Yes. If you did, you might have been able to tell that there's actually a speaking section, speaking test. I myself, when I was taking the TOEFL test a long time ago, we did not really have a special speaking session. But I think alongside the development of technology, now we can just audio record, and you can just speak through, I think, like 15 seconds or 30 seconds describing like a picture or something. That was my experience. So it has actually evolved. The testing, the language assessment has evolved because of these different perspectives. So let's move on to heterogeneous competence. So this is another type of competence that people have described about, which has to do with this idea of multiple abilities. So heterogeneous usually implies multiple, right? So it has to do with the multiple competences that are often unsystematic. So these are not usually that systematic when we are talking about heterogeneous competence because they are all in the process of being formed. Because they are all not stable at the same time, so they are all being developed, usually simultaneously. So Tyrone in 1988 started talking about how a child or adults, even slips or hesitations or self-corrections are potentially connected to this idea of heterogeneous competence because they are all being formed and not yet fully stabilized that we do make these mistakes, right? Hesitations and such. However, what could be the criticism that follows this idea of performance-based, or I would have to say that focuses on the heterogeneous competence? Yeah.
When I even use my first language Korean, I also do hesitations with self-correction. So I don't think I'm not yet stabilized.
Yes. Yes. So when we talk about, I think that would be definitely one of this idea related to the major criticism that focused on this idea that competence, going back to Chomsky that we talked about last time related to nativist point of view, it consists more of the abilities between the hearer and the speaker in a very idealized relationship. But that is not in fact true, right? The hearer and the speaker changes over time. And in addition to that, it lacks this understanding of various multiple variables, including memory loss, for example. We have sometimes have short memory. A lot of the times we have distractions. I think sometimes we can hesitate because of, let's say, somebody is talking to me at the same time, or we have shifts of attention, like you're no longer interested in the other person or the talk or interest could be one. So there could be multiple reasons that causes these reactions. So those were one of the major criticism that this idea received in terms of the first language acquisition. Okay, so we are going to move on next. So in your textbook, the author argues that comprehension, for example, listening and reading, must not be equated with competence, nor should production, speaking and writing, be thought of only as performance. I think this is a very alarming statement. I forgot which page this came from, but with your partners again, try to take some time and go over the following questions. First of all, what does this statement suggest about the relationship between competence and performance that we just talked about? Second, can you think about an example where comprehension exceeds production or vice versa? The third, how does this idea challenge a simple competence versus performance distinction? And finally, in L1 acquisition, how might children demonstrate competence even when their production appears to be limited? So you can focus on one of the question over another again and try to spend some time with your partners and we'll talk as a whole group after about 4 minutes. So it seems like all of you have been talking about very interesting ideas. So let's talk about them together. So let's go to the first question. I think this question and the third question is somewhat related to one another. So we can talk about them in groups. What do you think about this statement, first of all, related to this idea of competence and performance? So when you think about competence and performance, it's very nicely divided up into two, right? And even if you take a look at the tree on, which page was it? On page 35, you'll be able to find it looks very nice, right? Because it nicely divides it up into competence and performance and comprehension and also performance in that way too. But what do you guys think about this idea?
I think competence and performance can have real cause and effect relationship.
Oh, so you mean that they're interrelated, affecting one another? Yes, absolutely.
I think if competence is not satisfied, then performance must be poor. But I think there is the case that only performance is good, but not good competence.
Only performance is
Good, but poor competence.
only performance is good, but poor competence. So you're talking about how competence relies on the performance, or performance relies on competence, or are they all relying on one another?
One direction.
One direction. So it's usually the competence to performance. Interesting thought. So here we have a relationship of an idea that competence influences performance, and that could in fact be true. But could we only say that what is performed really tells us quite a lot about the whole picture of the competence then? Do you think it's like equal? I think that's what this tree was trying to describe in terms of what is hidden might be much broader, right, than what is seen, right? So it might in fact be shown from the roots to the tree. So we can have that flow, but we might not be able to make a haste judgment that what we only see represents what's hidden, right? So I think that's another thing to think about, how one influences the other, but also not really just looking at the performance and seeing that that is everything. So I think that has to do with this idea that the relationship between competence and performance. In addition to that, here in this tree, you can also try to think about the difference between comprehension and also production in that way. Because a lot of the times people think that production is performance, but this tree again is telling us that that is not really the case. I think going back to what we just looked at, the production and comprehension is both underneath performance. What we said about how performance is something that we can see, or that someone does or perform. When we think about listening or reading, people often think that it's very passive. So it's more related to competence rather than performance. However, the statement is saying that that is not true, right? Even listening and reading is a sign of performance. We can tell that from, let's say, for example, when we have, in terms of research, in order to find out about the reading ability, we use the eye tracking, for example, the technologies to really track whether that person is paying attention or getting the idea correctly by asking reading comprehension questions, right? So we have different ways to understand the performance, but listening and reading does not mean that it does not have a performance element. That is one of the reasons why in your syllabus, you'll be able to find that I say listening, and when you guys are doing a small group discussion, I also feel like listening attentively to other people is a part of performance, right? If you are not listening, we can tell, right? If you're not reading the text, I can also tell. So that's also a sign of performance. So that's what this author was trying to say in terms of the difference between comprehension and production, and also competence versus performance. Can you actually think of an example where comprehension exceeds production, or vice versa, or production exceeding comprehension? Yes.
Comprehension exceeds production for like babies who cannot make complete sentences, but they can still express what they want to say. But at the same time, I think production exceeds comprehension when they just simply imitate what their parents say, or just writing down words without understanding.
Yes. So I think that is very nicely captured. I think that was a very good answer, right? When we think about the relationship between the two, sometimes we see a case where comprehension seems to be exceeding the production and the vice versa. So there are these cases and some of the examples that you have actually talked about in your own groups, where we can find them in both children and also adults at sometimes. I think some of you might in fact feel like, oh, I think I know this is something that I should in fact say, but you might just stay silent, right? That's so from the production side, it might not really be produced, but in fact, we can tell that somebody has comprehended. Sometimes you can feel that, oh, my comprehension is much better than my production at this certain stage, or you can find that it actually shifts over time. Moving on to the last question then. In L1 acquisition, how might children demonstrate confidence even when their production appears limited? I think that's what we just talked about. You can actually find a lot of kids understanding and following the rules, although they might not be able to say them out loud. That's will be the case where we can find that they have the confidence to understand the pragmatic rules, what they are supposed to do. When their parent says no, sit, they might actually sit, right? So we can in fact find them instead rather than just for them using the language. So I think that will be the case in some of the answers that we shared regarding these discussion questions. Okay, so let's move on to the next idea, which goes to the idea of nature and nurture. When I ask you guys, which one do you think is more important, nature or nurture? I think we can go on and on about this topic for hours and hours, right? And some people have different opinions related to it, and I value that. It's just that we just need to acknowledge that there are these different perspectives related to how children are educated in a way. And so when we talk about nature, as you can tell from the word nature, we believe that a child is born with this innate knowledge of or predisposition toward language. This is more like nativist approach understanding, right? They are born with this grammar, universal grammar, that they already have a system, and they can just learn what they are born with. So this idea of a predetermined biological timetable seems to guide the language development. So it's like dependent on their let's say as they move from age 1 to 2, they start learning different types. So they're just using what they're born with. However, nurture is highlighting more of that environmental factors. So language behaviors are shaped and internalized through environmental input and social interaction. And second, learning is influenced by experience, exposure, and attention. So environmental factors here cannot be understood cannot be ignored. So that's what we have been looking at so far in terms of the connectionists have talked about, and that these experiences and previous exposure are important. So these two ideas, nature and nurture, regardless of which one that you are more leaning toward, we just have to understand that they are both at work in language learning process. But moving more towards the nature idea in terms of the universals and universal grammar that we said that we are going to talk more about last time, universals has to do with this claim, this idea that language is acquired in broadly similar ways across human populations. So that points to how people around the globe speaking so many different languages, but they seem to go through similar paths in their language learning process. So people started to wonder, it seems like we are born with this idea of universal grammar, regardless of where you are born or which environment that you're born into, you're going to be able to learn the language. So that is the reason why, for example, let's say that you are Korean, but let's say that you are born in Mexico, then you might, and being exposed to the different languages, you might be able to speak the language of that target community. So that has to do with this idea of universals. And also, it again suggests that deep structural properties of language may be shared across all languages. This idea of that language is universally acquired seems to, in the same manner, is suggested by universals. And in fact, this allows us to make some sort of a cross-linguistic variation. So we can study how how the different languages seems to be different, or the variety between languages could be studied in this vein. The universal grammar, therefore, points to a hypothesized set of innate linguistic principles underlying all human languages. So this idea of all human languages is stressed in universal grammars, okay? So every single language. One of the things that seems to be, according to nativism, because it has to do with the nativist approach, as you can tell, according to nativism, however, it seems like people are, after we reach a certain stage, then the only language development happens with the lexical items. So that's also their argument that after you reach a certain stage in language, then the expansion only occurs in the lexical items rather than the new grammar, for example, for one language. So now we are going to move on to the next discussion question, which has to do with systematicity and variability. This one is on your textbook, let's say, where is it? On page 41, if you want to read that part again, try to talk about the main difference between the two concepts of systematicity and variability. And then afterwards, try to take a look at the examples that you see on page 43 and 44. You'll be able to find three different anecdotes, conversations, and try to think about what can we argue about the role of imitation in language learning. You can also refer back to the video that we just watched at the beginning. So let's first talk about these questions for about 3 minutes, and we'll talk as a whole group. So let's talk about these questions. First of all, what do you think is the main difference between this idea of systematicity and variability in language learning? Yes.
They can learn language in like organized way,
Mm-hmm.
but the variability is like they do not like follow like the exact stage.
Yes.
Like it can be happen like in different time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's absolutely right. Wu, do you want to add something new, or is that pretty much what you wanted to say too? Okay, great. So when we talk about systematicity, we can feel that, it seems like it starts small and moves, it gets bigger and more complex. So there seems to be a system, right, in it. However, at the same time, there are so many different cases, which tells us that but every learner learns it a little bit differently, right? So it does not mean that every single person moves from the step 1 to step 2 in the same way. It's the same pattern. So it seems like there are definitely the variability that exists amongst individual learners. So we have to both be somewhat cautious about how there seems to exist this broad systematicity, but within each, there are definitely variability that we need to be careful of. So that's the main message here. In addition to that, here the author goes to provide different anecdotes or different interactions between a child and an adult, I think it was, mother and father. What can we tell about the imitation?
Like one thing that I found interesting is their attention span.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like they cannot like pay attention to the meaning and the grammar at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So at the earliest stage of child learning, we often say that imitation serves a very important role, right? Because the children can imitate and make meaning through it. But at the same time, they need to reach a certain level of understanding of the semantic meaning in order to really grasp the idea. So you can tell that the mother and the father is trying very hard to fix the grammar of these children, but children are at the stage where they did not really reach the level to really comprehend the meaningfulness of their interaction. So meaningfulness related to how what they have said means something else. Right. So they did not really reach that level at this point. And we can in fact tell that about how the child development, especially related to the first language acquisition, points to the idea of the importance of imitation, but it can also tell us about to what extent are they capable of in making sense of the interaction and the meaning. So that has to do with what we have seen so far. If you go to page 41, you'll be able to read a little bit more about language and thought. I did not really create another slide for that, but language and thought pretty much tells us quite a lot about what we have so far seen in terms of the different theories, how the cognition, the nativists looked at the practices of the idea of the cognitive ability. We talked about the behaviorist approaches, for example. We also looked at the social interaction so far. In addition to that, in that particular section, you'll be able to find somebody called Benjamin Whorf, Sapir-Whorf, I think Benjamin. Who did they cite? I think they just Benjamin Whorf. Has anyone heard about something called Sapir-Whorf theory? Okay, so it talks about the relationship between language and thought. I think I asked you guys at the very beginning of this course about how do you think your thought is governed? Do you think your language drives your thought or your worldview, or do you think it's your worldview influencing the language that you use? So basically, the person who was mentioned last in this particular section called Benjamin Whorf talked about how our language influences our worldview. So that's an additional part, which is, I think we are going to talk about that when we start talking about culture and language and identity, because that's also closely connected concepts. So we'll come back to that later on, probably towards the end of the semester. So this week, we are again going to be introduced to two different types of methods as we did last time. We have something called the series method, which refers to a language teaching method in which learners practice a connected series of sentences forming a meaningful story or sequence of events. So this idea is somewhat modern in that case, which emphasizes meaning through context without translation or explicit grammatical explanation. But it has to do with series. So let's say that you are talking about a storyline that you go to school. You wake up at 7 o'clock and you eat something. And so you eat your breakfast and you study English. Then you do something. So it's much more of a sequence. I think you might have seen these activities where kids play with chunks of actions and you put them into series and you talk about what happens next and next. So that's more related to this idea of series methods. The benefit of this might be that you'll be able to learn the expressions that seems to be connected to one another, right? You're not bringing language learners from one setting, like the classroom setting, to like a workplace setting. You're not moving from one to another, but it's much more closely connected. So that could be the benefit related to the series method. The book also introduces something called direct method. So this is a language teaching method that was popular in the early 20th century, which emphasized exclusive use of the target language, which means that in the classroom, L1 is not being used. Also, the oral communication skills and the inductive grammar learning was important in this case. In the direct method, what was highlighted was they were looking at second language or foreign language learning as if they're learning the first language. So, when you're learning your first language, you're not translating it into any other languages, but you are much more immersed in the setting, using a lot of these active oral communication skills and interaction, very spontaneous. So the language used was very spontaneous. And there was little or almost no grammatical rules being taught specifically in this direct method. Okay, so for the remaining time, we have about 5 minutes. I want you to look back into what we have so far described about the different types of theories that we talked about, and think about which theory best explains each of this method and try to fill in the blank. I know that the table looks very small, but you can make it bigger. And can one method reflect more than one theory? And try to think about some of the examples. So I'll give you guys about 4 minutes. And for the remaining time, we'll wrap up. And I guess that's it. So with your partners, try to fill it in. And we'll talk about the answers together. Okay, so let's talk about the answers together. Okay. It might be somewhat difficult without really having an understanding of how it works out. It might be, you're trying to understand it from what is described in the textbook, but it might be a little bit difficult in that sense. But let's still go ahead and try to understand it in more depth. First of all, how many people think that series method is more leaning towards the behaviorist approach? Nativist approach? Functional approach? Okay, more people in functional, yeah. So I would have to agree with you all that it is, in fact, more related to the functional approach. How about direct method? Behaviorist? Nativist? Functional? Surprisingly, they're both more geared towards functional approaches, and we'll talk about the reason why. However, I would have to say some people actually raise your hands related to the nativist approach for direct method, and that is in fact right. As I mentioned at the very early on, that they seems to be reflecting more than one theory. These methods do ground on more than one theories at the same time, and we are going to talk about them in more detail. So I prepared this chart that we are going to go through them together. Regarding the series method, we would have to say, first of all, as you guys have been able to grasp the idea, that it best aligns with functional approach and partly the emergentist views. What we mean by the emergentist views is that they are looking at these patterns that emerge from exposure to meaningful input. That's what emergentism refers to. The book talks about the emergentism, so if you want to really look into that, that's also fine. But what I wanted to essentially highlight was that each of these methods might be grounded on more than one theory, okay? In the series method, for example, the teacher, let's first take a look at the example on the right-hand side. Let's say the teaching, they're talking about the teacher brings out like an action-based storytelling, right? And the students learn expressions while acting out a sequence, like not going through the drills or the rules as I mentioned. So for example, I open the door, I walk in, I sit down. So it's in a sequence of what you guys did this morning, right? So in the language classroom, you learn through these meaningful sequences of action. In this case, language is learned through contextualized meaning, experience, and cognitive sequencing. So this idea of contextualized meaning is somewhat connected to the emergentism because emergentism was against the nativist view. So that's how it is somewhat overlapping with the functional view, but it is stressing more of this idea of massive exposure to meaningful language input. However, the direct method is aligning most closely with functional and also partly with the nativist view in that sense. And it emphasizes the very naturalistic exposure, communication, and inductive learning from input. I think that is the reason why you thought that it was more closely connected to nativist approach. And you're right. However, when you think about direct method, you're also engaging them in social interaction, right? So therefore, it is more considered to be also functional. This suggests learners internalize patterns through comprehensible input and interaction rather than explicit instruction. So for example, the teacher is bringing a textbook, for example, and says like, in English class, what is this? This is a book. So I'm using the target language, but using also pictures and the objects, for example, without using the second language, the student's mother tongue. So teacher teaches vocabulary using pictures and interaction without translation. So you can in fact find like a lot of these methods that we learn about in this class, you can make connection between. So what do you think has influenced the development of this particular method, or what has triggered it not to be used anymore, or what are some of the challenges related to it? Okay, so I'm going to stop here for today, and next week we are going to move on to age. So we are going to talk about, does age really matter? So before we come back to next class, try to remember to read the textbook, the chapter before you come, if possible. And if you have any questions, I guess, please stay and ask me. And otherwise, that's it for today's class. Well done, everyone, and I will see you guys next week.